Welcome back, everybody. Today I'm in Oxford and I'm talking to Dorothy Bishop, who's a professor for psychology at the University of Oxford. Thank you so much for your time, Dorothy. I read your interesting comment in Nature magazine about the reproducibility crisis. Could you maybe start with briefly summarizing what this is all about?
Yes. So in psychology, we've been very well aware just over the recent probably 10, 15 years that there's been a problem with psychology, results not replicating, and for some time people just thought this was maybe a pedantic problem that statisticians were picking up on and so on. And then we had a big study done that actually tried to reproduce some results that had been published in quite respectable journals and found that really only about 30 to 40% of them did reproduce. And so everybody started to get a bit alarmed about this and consider what the problem was and what we can do about it. And I really first got heavily involved when I was asked to chair a meeting at the Academy of Medical Sciences, which wasn't really so much about psychology but about biomedical sciences in general. And it turned out that they had also been really getting concerned, interestingly enough, largely because the pharmaceutical industry was getting concerned, because they were trying to build on results that had been coming out of experimental labs in bioscience and finding that they couldn't reproduce the basic results, so they couldn't get past first base. And so we had this very interesting symposium which had a whole diverse collection of people there, including a physicist telling us about how they do things in physics, but also people from industry, and a lot of issues arose, and it was clear there's no one cause and there's no one solution. And that some of the solutions are more to do with incentive structures, which I think is something you're very interested in. But also I got more and more interested in the extent to which we had problems with how people were designing their studies, often not intentionally. We're not talking here about fraud, we're talking about sort of people designing studies in ways that are not going to be optimal for finding out what's really going on. And so in this Nature paper, I just summarised some things I have from a talk I give on this, which was really talking about what I call the 4 horsemen of the reproducibility apocalypse. I have to try and remember all of them. The first one is publication bias. So the fact that we know, and that affects all disciplines, that it's much easier to publish things that show a positive, exciting result than a null result. And that was really affecting, I think, not just psychology, and it's been known about for a long time, but it just goes on, and to the extent that I think most scientists wouldn't even try and publish something if it wasn't significant, because they would feel it wouldn't get accepted. So there's this notion of this big file drawer full of stuff that isn't published, which distorts the literature, because if you think of any particular research question, there should be a sort of cumulative process of building on previous research. But if the only research that comes through and is sort of filtered out is the stuff with positive results, you get a very distorted idea. So publication bias is number one. Number two is what we call p-hacking in psychology, which is not so much that you select which papers to publish, but from within a study you select which specific results to pull out and focus on. And there's lots of ways you can p-hack. You can analyse your data many ways and just focus on the one way that gives you an interesting result, or you may gather data on lots and lots of variables but only report the ones that look exciting. And I got the impression that a lot of psychologists don't realise this is a problem and don't really appreciate how, again, this can really distort the literature, because they tend to think, oh, I've found something where the p-value is less than 0.05. It must mean something, and so that is the second big one. It's certainly in psychology. The next one is power, which is people doing studies with samples that are simply too small to show an effect that they want to show. Again, this has been talked about since the 1970s, but my impression again is that a lot of psychologists think it's statisticians being pedantic, and that really it doesn't matter. And that, so if they can only test 20 people in each of 2 groups, they sort of go on a wing and a prayer and think they'll find something. And in fact, the odds are very high that most of the sort of effect sizes we're talking about in psychology are really quite small. and it's become clear we need much, much bigger samples.
So what's the typical sample size that you have? Is it like some 50 people, or?
Well, it depends on the sub-area. So, I mean, in some areas it's really difficult to get large samples if you work, as I do, with special groups. So, you know, it can take 3 years for us to collect a sample of 30 children of a particular kind. But the solution there then is to sort of collaborate, and people are beginning to realise that we have to form larger collaborative enterprises to investigate some questions. I mean, if you're just doing questionnaire studies, it's obviously easy to get large samples. So it's very varied, and with things like brain imaging, it's just very expensive to collect large samples, because each brain scan you may pay £500. So, you know, people are not motivated to sort of get large samples until they realise, yeah, it's a real problem. And then just the fourth horseman is something that was described again many years ago as harking, which is hypothesizing after the results are known, and it ties in with p-hacking, because this is looking at your data and then finding from the morass of stuff there that you pull out one little interesting looking thing, but then you make out when you write it up that this was your hypothesis. So you tell a good story, and we're all told when we write up our results that it's important to tell a good story, but what you're not supposed to do is use the same data to generate a hypothesis, test a hypothesis. When you're harking, that's what you're doing. You're first of all looking at the data, and then you're saying, oh, that suggests this hypothesis, and then you use the same data to test it. And again, that can really create a lot of problems. So those are the four things that I've been particularly focused on. And I'm very interested in how we might fix them, and part of it is just educating people, and I'm very keen on using simulated data to just sort of where you know you are God, you know what the truth is because you've made up this data set to have certain characteristics, and then you can show people how, you know, they can p-hack and find something significant where there's nothing there. And conversely, you can simulate data where there is a real effect and show people how, if their sample is too small, how easy it is to miss it. So that is beginning to become more common in education, but it's still not routine that people are taught statistics that way, and I think that's a lot of the problem.
So maybe I should add for clarification that the problem with trying different analysis methods on the data is that you get the statistical significance wrong, because every different method of analysis is a new attempt to find something new.
Yes.
So you can screw yourself over
Yes.
by trying just around as often as you want to. And I'm afraid that this is something that partially also happens in physics. But what a lot of collaborations do in physics is that they decide on a method of analysis before they analyze the data, and then they stick with this. So what are people doing in psychology now to try to address these things?
So one of the things I really like is the development of something called registered reports as a publication model, and I've tried this on several occasions. And it does actually fix all four of those problems I mentioned, because what you do is you try to publish your introduction and methods, and your methods have to be very highly specified, ideally with a script saying how you're going to analyse the data, and maybe with some simulated data. And that is what is evaluated by reviewers. And they may suggest changes, just as normally this would all happen after you'd collected the data. This is happening prior to data collection. But they decide, is this an interesting question? Is this a good way of tackling it? Is the study adequately powered? And if you can persuade the reviewers, you can then get an in-principle acceptance from the journal who will publish your paper if you do what you then said you were going to do. And this puts all the time lag and everything early on in the process, and that's why people don't like it, because you're waiting for reviewer comments before you've even gathered data. But it does mean that reviewers can be much more constructive. But it also completely, and the person who's really developed this is Chris Chambers in the University of Cardiff, and he says, you know, the one thing that shouldn't affect a decision to publish it really is the results, because that's not, you know, contingent on the quality of the methods and things. So it should be more the quality of methods, the sensibleness of the question. And you basically break that link because you don't know the results at that point. So you get this in principle acceptance, and then provided you do what you said you wanted to do, you will get published. So it slows you up at the start, but by the time you finish gathering data, then the process is usually very rapid. So that is becoming increasingly popular, and initially very few journals would offer it as an option, but increasingly it's becoming more and more standard as people are realising that it actually gets rid of a lot of the problems and does help us do better science.
So the journals are offering this as an alternative method of review or something?
Yes, yes. But you have to have editors who know how it works and who are enthusiastic about it. And it's sort of, I think it's slowly beginning to break through, because it only came in about sort of 6 or 7 years ago, I think, that it was a new thing. And now, I know initially there was just one journal that was trying it out, and now I think there's about 200 or 300 offering it, not just psychology, but other disciplines too. And in fact, PLOS ONE now has just agreed to offer it. So that should be a big change.
But it's mostly in the life sciences, right?
I think so, yes. Yes.
Sociology maybe, something like
yes,
this.
And economics maybe as well.
Oh,
although
really?
In some of those areas, of course, you're talking, it gets complicated if you're talking about analysis of existing data sets. You then have less sort of control over whether somebody's really already had a sneak peek at it. So, yeah.
So you said earlier that these complaints from the statisticians about the p-value hacking and the small sample size have been around since the 70s.
Yeah.
So it was not like this was...
Or even earlier with some of them,
So given that this was so well known, how do you think it could get so far, that it would take so long for psychologists to notice?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two things. One is that people genuinely didn't understand how serious it was. And it's like you say, I mean, people see this p-value less than 0.05, they think this must be meaning something. And I mean, I try and illustrate it with, thinking of if you had somebody who was a magician and said, I can deal you a particular hand of cards, maybe, I don't play poker, but something that's quite unusual. And you come along and he deals it and you think, he's an amazing magician. But if you know that prior to you he's tried this on 100 other people who he didn't get this, and there's only 1 in 100 where it sort of actually worked, you have a completely different attitude towards that result. So you have to understand that you're talking about probabilities. They have to be interpreted in the context of all the tests that you've done. They're not a measure of an effect size in the same way that people think of it. So I think there's that misunderstanding. But the change, I think also, the very interesting change has been social media, because social media has given a voice to people that previously didn't have one, which is mainly junior, early career scientists, who may have been encouraged to do this or sort of really suffered as a result of finding they can't replicate something that was published and looked as if it was solid. And they're actually getting quite militant about making science better. And in the past, the only way if you found something in a journal that you didn't think was well done or didn't agree with, would you a letter to the editor, who may decide to publish it several months later. Whereas now people can zip up on Twitter and say,
So what do you mean with they're getting militant about it? They aggressively draw attention to it?
Yeah, and they're concerned to try and bring about all sorts of changes. So with a couple of colleagues, I've been running a course on advanced reproducible methods for 3 years now, 4 years, I think this was the 4th we've just done, with early career researchers. And they go off, really fired up. And in Oxford, we had a very good group of early career researchers who started various initiatives. So they started having a journal club called Reproducibility, with TEA at the end, where we drink tea and talk about relevant papers. But we also have had other events, and this has culminated in putting in a bid to the university to support someone to sort of really coordinate these activities. And my colleague in anthropology, Laura Fortunato, has headed up this bid to get funding across the university. So we're trying to bring in all disciplines to just improve the credibility of scholarship, even in humanities, where you might be talking about electronic collections of items in museums and so on, and sort of just making sure that things are open and properly documented, and if you're doing science, your scripts are available. But the other thing that we have to tackle is the incentive structure. So we have to make sure that the university when they're hiring and firing, when they're promoting people, that they have an interest in issues like, how credible your science is, rather than just is it in a flashy journal. But they are on board on that, and in part they're also heavily influenced by the funders, who are very motivated to bring about change. So that original meeting I was at Academy of Medical Sciences, that was supported by the Wellcome Trust and two of our research councils, MRC and BBSRC. And of course they don't want to spend their funds on research that isn't credible. So they are highly motivated to fix the problems. Once people became really aware of the problems, the motivation from the funders is there. And that will translate into new requirements for people submitting grant proposals, which mean that, whether they want to or not, I think this university does also want to do very high quality research, of course. And so again, once people become really aware of just how endemic the problems are, I think we're on the cusp now of really seeing quite a lot of change, and the way people do things is going to be quite different.
I find this super fascinating, because I always have this impression that in academia nothing ever moves, nothing ever changes.
Particularly, I have to say, at the University of Oxford, this tends to be horribly true, because we are an old institution where everybody's very, very careful, and many people have to be involved in all decisions. But it is nice that at heart there's a lot of people in the university in different disciplines who are all really very keen to bring about these changes, and that's our strength, really, because we keep finding new people. Somebody in economics, or somebody in politics, or somebody in computational biology, and they're all interested in this same goal, and they all have different ways of solving the problem. So I think we're the only place, internationally, who are trying to do something at the level of all disciplines converging. But we've only just started. We really got going in January. We launched in January, which is only last month. So we're already feeling very, very positive.
So you said you have the university administration and also the funding agencies behind you, which is a good start, and the community, of course.
Yes.
How important do you think it is that the public is aware of these problems and of your efforts to do something about it?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Which was raised at this initial meeting we were at, because there were some people who were saying, well, we mustn't really say too much about the problems because the public will lose confidence. But there were people there who I agreed with, who were science journalists, who said this is appalling. You need to talk about the problems, otherwise people will really lose confidence. There is a difficulty, which is it can be weaponized. So already we've seen this happening in the US, where people who have a particular agenda that they don't want the Trump government to, or the Trump government doesn't want to, for example, obey regulations about environmental protections, are starting to say, well, we don't have to take any notice of any regulations unless the data is open. And given that data on things like asbestos was gathered years ago, before there was a chance for open data, they can therefore decide that they don't want to take any notice of it, or they can just say, well, all the stuff on climate change, of course, science is not very reliable, there's different points of view. So that's the hardest thing, really, is trying to, on the one hand, be open and honest about what we're doing, while on the other hand, ensuring that this doesn't therefore act as a hostage to fortune and allow people to just weaponize what that we're doing. And the best way, though, is to just make sure that science is really, really good, I think. And the more self-correcting, the faster we self-correct and deal with problems, I think the less easy it will be for people to just try to deny bits of science that they don't like.
Do you also have people, or do you know example of people who are actually commenting on this habit of p-value hacking as something, to argue that one should not take this or that science seriously?
I don't think p-hacking particularly, but I think, even I as a reviewer, I have to say, I've got quite sceptical about quite a lot of things that come through if the data isn't open, and particularly I always more and more think I just wish people would, even if they don't go down the route of doing a full registered report, if they would at least pre-register their plan and their hypothesis. So rather recently I actually had to referee a paper which I was very concerned probably was affected by p-hacking, And you know, the authors just say, because they've pulled out one little result here, and the authors reply and just say, well, you know, everybody does it. You know, we respond, and they're right. I mean, everybody does, but you know, this is not an adequate excuse for doing it. So it's a problem.
Yeah, I actually think that kind of argument greatly contributes to the problem.
Yeah,
because it's why people don't realize there's something wrong with it.
Exactly.
Because that's what we have learned.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
That's what everybody does. It must be okay.
And in psychology, there's even a very classic example of a sort of guidebook to how to be a good scientist, which explicitly recommends this. Both p-hacking and harking. You know,
oh, really?
Yes, it says, don't feel you have to test your hypothesis. What you first do is you look at your data and you look at them every way you can and find what's interesting and then construct the paper around that.
Oh God, that's painful.
Yeah. So...
yeah, but when it comes to the involvement of the public, I have to say that I think it's probably worse to try to sweep the problems under the rug instead of being open about it and say we have a problem but we're working on it.
Yeah, I agree. But I think we do have to be rather shamefaced about some of the things. I mean, it does mean confessing to quite a lot of phenomena that, certainly in psychology, there have been some what we thought were very robust and you know, things that made it into textbooks that now we're beginning to realise probably don't stand up or are much weaker, at least, than we thought they were.
Well, we will see what holds up, I guess.
Yes.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. I think this is a good place to wrap this up. Thanks,
thank
everybody.
You for the chance. Yeah,
thank you. Thanks, everybody, for watching, and I'll see you next week.
Yeah.